Hey guys, welcome back to More English with Dry. Today we are taking our first look at some of the specific questions from the English language exams in more detail. Today we are looking at AQA Language Paper 2, Question 2. Now, you should know that this paper is called Writers' Viewpoints and Perspectives. It is the paper where you are given two non-fiction sources that you need to compare, one that is usually fairly contemporary and one that is often from the 19th or very early 20th centuries. The paper we're going to look at today is readily available on the GCSE AQA website. It is the paper that looks at both Glastonbury Music Festival and the Greenwich Fair. We're going to be taking a look in particular at question 2. So this is the question where you need to write a summary of the differences between source A and source B. That is nearly always the structure of the question. There is a possibility you'll be asked to write about a summary of the similarities, but more often than not is about the differences. You should be prepared, though, to do both. The question is worth 8 marks. I personally think you need to be writing 2 fully developed comparative paragraphs to make sure you get those 8 marks. Okay, so what I'm going to do is firstly take you through these sources, but even before that, we are going to look just a little bit more in depth at what the question is asking you to do, okay? You are being asked to talk about, in this question, the things to see and do at Glastonbury Festival and Greenwich Fair. Now, having taught this paper and marked it as a mock paper for several years, I can tell you that one of the most common issues that people have is with actually writing about the things to see and do. Now, this would only refer to events or activities that have been deliberately put on as part of the 2 events. Anything you refer to that is not part of this, so for instance, the weather, is not something you can talk about because it's not been put on as part of the event. You don't go to a music festival to see the weather. Equally, you cannot talk about anything that happens outside of the 2 festivals. That would not come under the category either, because it's not deliberately been put on by the festival organisers or the fair organisers, and would again get you no marks. The lesson here is that it is extremely important to read the question. I have no doubt that every single person watching this video will have a teacher who's told them to do that, but I need to reiterate it again, because this is the perfect example of a question where if you do not read it properly and do what it says, you can lose out on marks. So, source A. Elizabeth Day has been sent to report on the 2005 Glastonbury Festival for a Sunday newspaper, and the title of the piece is Are We Having Fun Yet? Anton is standing knee-deep in tea-coloured water. He is covered in a slippery layer of dark brown mud, like a gleaming otter emerging from a riverbed. The occasional empty bottle of Somerset cider wafts past his legs, carried away by the current. I mean, he says with a broad smile and a strange, staring look in his dilated eyes, where else but Glastonbury would you find all this? He sweeps his arms in a grandiose arc, encompassing a scene of near total devastation. In one field, a series of tents has lost its moorings in a recent thunderstorm and is floating down the hillside. The tents are being chased by a group of shivering, half-naked people who look like the survivors of a terrible natural disaster. Now, this first section is a perfect illustration of my main point, which is that a lot of students choose to answer on this final point, the effect of the weather, i.e. tents that have become disconnected from their moorings and float down a hillside, and that people look like survivors of a disaster. Now, what we can say about that is they are happening at Glastonbury, but they're not intended to be happening, so they do not answer the question. The festival organisers did not intend for any of this to take place, so therefore, no marks if you bring it up. Carrying on. When I was told that the Sunday Telegraph was sending me to experience Glastonbury for the first time, my initial reaction was one of undiluted horror. Still, I thought at least the weather was good. England was in the grip of a heatwave. But then the rains came, 6 hours of uninterrupted thunderstorm in the early hours of Friday morning. When I arrived later that day, there was a polite drizzle. By yesterday, the rain had given way to an overcast sky, the colour of exhaled cigarette smoke. The mud, however, remained, and the only way to get around the 900-acre site was, like Anton, to resign oneself to getting very dirty indeed. Everything else might have been damp, but the crowd remained impressively good-humoured throughout. It's a very safe, family-friendly atmosphere, says Ed Thaw, a music student from London. This is my 6th time at Glastonbury, and I've never had any trouble. Indeed, on my train to Castlecarry, the carriages are rammed with well-spoken degree students sipping Pimm's and making polite chit-chat. Now, Again, we can see things that look like they might be the kind of facts that answer this question. Thunderstorms, train carriage rides there. However, again, neither of these things are deliberately intended by the festival. They're things either happening around the festival or they're things happening almost by accident at the festival. Therefore, they're not things to see and do. It shouldn't surprise you to know that this question can often take a while to find the section that you're supposed to talk about. The source is very long, but it asks you to look at the whole thing for this question. Therefore, it might be in the final third of it before you actually see any evidence or any information that you are to talk about. The acts for 2005 included Coldplay, Elvis Costello, and the American rock band The Killers, who brought a touch of salubriousness to the proceedings by performing in tuxedo jackets and glitter. But Glastonbury has still managed to preserve a healthy degree of wackiness. In the Las Vegas area, a 1950s-style diner comes complete with fancy-dressed rock and roll dancers and a constant stream of Elvis songs. The Chapel of Love and Loathing has a disc jockey booth disguised as a church organ. Apparently, couples can get married here. Outside, a man wearing a huge pink afro wig is twirling round and round in bare feet. "What happened to your shoes?" I ask. "They got washed away with my tent," he says cheerily. Bizarrely, everyone seems to be having a brilliant time, and there are broad grins wherever I look. In fact, it's almost nice, this Glastonbury thing. So you can see that part at the top that is highlighted in yellow is something that has been specifically put on by the organisers of Glastonbury. They have gotten in touch with Coldplay, Elvis Costello, and the Killers and invited them to come and play. Equally, they have deliberately set up a 50s-style diner. They've on purpose put in a constant stream of Elvis songs, and they've hired rock and roll dancers to come and perform there. So therefore, these things are all purposefully and deliberately taking place. As such, they are things that you could talk about in this question. I won't read to you the entirety of source B, mainly because it's Dickens and it's long and I frankly don't want to, but I will go through briefly the same tactic just to show you which parts do and do not answer the question. So to begin with, Dickens talks about the road to Greenwich, and also therefore the balcony of every public and private house that is on the way there. Now, it should be clear to you by now that because these places are on the road to Greenwich, is that there's no relevant information for your question. You're asked what happens at the fair, not near it, not around it. So therefore, again, the first couple of paragraphs contain nothing that you would talk about in this question. As we carry on, we hear about the public houses and then the park. Now, the park here, as we can tell again, is not part of the fair. So therefore, unlike what unfortunately a lot of students have done, you cannot write about it. I know I seem to be repeating myself here, but it is the same point all the way through. In fact, what you need to look out for is what I've highlighted here in the first yellow box, which is the point at which it says the fair itself. Your alarm bells should be ringing there because now suddenly you should be thinking, oh, this is me, this is the part I'm to answer the question for. Now we were actually there. We can start to highlight the things to see and do. Now that includes stalls that sell toys and food, and also lots of different types of produce that you are able to buy. Indeed, it carries on, and there is actually quite a bit more in this source that you could choose to talk about versus source A. Dickens, as he always does, gives us an enormous list of things: trumpets, penny dittos, bands playing at the same time, etc., etc., booths with stages, brightly illuminated lamps, and pantomimes taking place. Well, there you go. Take your pick. That is all stuff that you can talk about in your answer. So, now we have got the actual skill of identifying what you can talk about, we need to figure out how you can put together your answer, okay? So this question only assesses AO1. Now AO1, according to the AQA, is identify and interpret explicit and implicit information and ideas, select and synthesize evidence from different texts. Now, as ever it is, the AQA has given you a lot of buzzwords there, and it's not actually that clear what they want. Something they do not want, however, is language analysis. So, any students who ever write about similes and metaphors and the connotations of keywords will get no marks if they do it in question 2. That is for question 3 and 4, not for this one. So don't waste all the good points you have here, save them for later. But what does this really mean, this mark scheme? Well, interpreting something simply means explaining the meaning of, okay? It's not anything more complicated than explaining the meaning of things. The only slight connotational difference from explain is that to interpret, you have to think a bit harder, because explaining might be very straightforward. But in general, that's all you're doing. Implicit is a good word to know about. It says explicit and implicit. Now, something implicit is something which is hinted at but not directly said. Explicit's the opposite, it's something that is directly said. So, what you're trying to find is the hidden message behind the words. Finally, information ideas, well, that's what we've already looked at and found anything said in the sources that relate to the question you've been asked. I've included the relate to the question you've been asked because that's always important to remember, but really it's the second one of these that's the most significant in how you're answering. You need to find what the writer is saying, but not directly saying. An example I always like to give is you think of the teacher who says, "Thank you for coming to my lesson." Now, if you arrive on time at the beginning, at 11:30 or whenever it is you've got English, and the teacher says, "Well, thank you for arriving," they probably mean it. However, if you get there at 11:15, you're 15 minutes late, they might say, "Thank you for arriving at my lesson." Now, the clear implicit difference is that sarcasm and they don't mean it. But you've only been able to tell that by the tone of voice. Now, obviously, tone is not conveyed in writing, but it's the same idea. You are looking for things that are not obviously being said quite in words, but the meaning of the tone behind the words. I'll show you a bit more what I mean. So, source A, our information and ideas. We agreed it was that the acts for 2005 included Coldplay, Elvis Costello, and the American rock band The Killers, who brought a touch of salubriousness to the proceedings by performing in tuxedo jackets and glitter. But what inferences, what implicit information can we find here? Well, firstly, the acts are all different, and they have individual specific names. You might say, well, that's pretty obvious, that's not necessarily implicit, but let's take it a step further. They're wearing smart clothing and putting on a good show. Okay? We can work that out from from the word salubriousness and also from the fact they're wearing tuxedo jackets and glitter. Finally, though, we can tell the festival is well organized and people come just to watch these individual bands. So suddenly, we have actually managed to figure out something about Glastonbury Festival that the writer has not said. It's clearly a festival from the fact that we have been told just 3 of the names of artists, where they pay for the most prominent and the most popular bands to come, and people would come just to see them, and it's important to them to put on a good show and be very professional. With the Greenwich Fair, one of the sections I picked out that we'd highlighted was the bellowings of speaking trumpets, the squeaking of penny dittos, the noise of a dozen bands with 3 drums in each all playing different tunes at the same time. So, implicit inference 1. You can hear lots of different noises all at once, okay? That's pretty basic and straightforward. But if we take that further, the fact they are playing different songs cannot sound good. It's a pretty obvious fact that if you hear lots of bands playing all at once, that it's not going to sound that good. I'm sure at Glastonbury, if the Killers, Elvis Costello, and Coldplay all tried to play at once, it would be bad also. And so therefore, finally, we can infer that the fair is not well organised, as all the musicians are competing to be heard. So straight away, we have an enormous difference between the two. One is a professional music concert that is attended by music fans. The other one is less well organized. It is full of different musicians doing different things who therefore may not be as professional or famous, and that there's almost a sense of chaos going on. So if we look at how to structure an answer, I've split it up into 7 bullet points for you, okay? Now this would be one big paragraph, and I would suggest that you would write 2 of them. So you'd begin by outlining what the writer of source A discusses. So that might be just a little summary of his main point. Firstly, the writer of source A discusses, and then you include your first quote. The quotation ... suggests ... Now, you have to have quotes in this or references, and that is part of the mark scheme for A01, otherwise that you will not receive the full amount of marks. But even After you include the quotation, I instantly want you to use the word suggests and then use one of your first inferences. Use some of the implicit information that you have worked out, because that is the part that really gets you the highest level answer in this question. It's the inferences you make. If you simply list 4 things about source A and then 4 different things about source B, you will never get beyond band 2 of the mark scheme. You need to begin to make inferences straight away, which is why I would then encourage you to use the word furthermore or some other connective like that. From this, we can infer. Now, by using that word infer, you are showing the marker that you are going to try to get the highest level marks in this question. For English language section A, there are no marks for how well you actually write. So that means that it's not like an essay. It's not like the section B. There's no marks for organization. There's no marks for spelling or anything like that. So your answer can be as formulaic as you want. And if you keep using the word infer, that's almost like a little beacon to the examiner that you are actually now attempting to answer their question. So when they see that word, they will be on red alert to give you these higher level marks. Obviously, you need to do it right, but the point is the word infer is a nice signpost for them. Then you would have a comparative statement with source B. You can do source B first if you want. It doesn't matter in the slightest. But here, for argument's sake, I've said, whereas the writer of source B says. Now, in an answer like this, where you're talking about the differences, you'll always want one of those connectives that shows the other side of something. You know, if the question was similarities, you might say something like, equally, the writer of source B says. But in this case, it's differences, so I've written whereas. And there again, you briefly sum up what they're talking about. You then include your quote, and then you include your inferences. Now, the only thing I recommend you do, this is not essential, but I think it will help, is a kind of summary sentence. Now, this shouldn't be huge, but it just brings all into one point the difference between the answers that the difference between the sources that you are looking at. And therefore, this should really summarize everything you're saying and make it clear for the marker to actually see your point and the inferences of implicit information that you have made about the two texts. Now, I recommend you do this whole thing twice, as I said, 2 paragraphs of each one containing all of that. Obviously, time is much more important. So if you find you only have time to do 1, well, then you'd need to move on to question 3. However, in general, if you aim for that and you do it properly, I think that you should be able to get 8 out of 8 every time. I'm briefly going to show you how I would structure my own answer to this question. So, firstly, the writer of Source A describes Glastonbury not only as a modern festival, but one that is all about live music and bringing a range of different styles together. This includes Coldplay, Elvis Costello, and the American rock band The Killers, as well as a 1950s-style diner with rock and roll dancers and Elvis songs. This suggests that the organisers are trying to include as many different genres as possible. Furthermore, from this we can infer that Glastonbury is intended to attract all and any music lovers. Perhaps it is a place where people can come together and share their musical tastes and enjoy expanding their horizons by sampling new ones. Whereas, the writer of Source B presents the Greenwich Fair as more theatrical and raucous. Dickens talks about shops, bands, parades, pantomimes, and various other dramatic presentations. This suggests that the focus of the fair is on far more than just music. This tells the reader that the festival's chaotic and almost a sensory overload, with people not knowing what to do first. Therefore, the 2 texts differ as Glastonbury seems to be an event designed specifically for music fans and experts to come and more calmly appreciate some of the world's most famous bands. However, Greenwich is somewhere where anyone can come and find something enjoyable and fun to do, and where there is much less structure, but much more random excitement and communal spirit. So, to color code, obviously that first line, I'm briefly summarizing section A. I am then including my quotes in the second sort of little bit, but I'm also including my very first inference with this suggests that the organisers are trying to include as many different genres as possible. I then develop this inference, taking it as far as I can in the furthermore section. I'm looking very hard at what implicit information is being given. I'm trying my best to develop it to show that I've truly understood the meaning the writer is giving behind what there is to see and do at Glastonbury. I then compare, whereas the writer of Source B presents Greenwich as this, so I'm showing that there is something different about Source B, and the fair that Dickens is describing. He talks about shops, bands, parades, pantomimes, etc. You'll see that I'm embedding my quote here. I'm not quoting directly. That is, of course, fine. The thing that I have done, the reason I've done that is because Dickens' texts are always very long, and it's much easier for me to just do it like this. And then again, this suggests that the focus of the fair, blah, blah, blah. I'm using my first level inference, and then I'm showing with the next part that I'm making it in even more detail. I'm including more inference, more implicit information beyond what has just been written directly. And this final part, now I mentioned it was quite important. What I'm doing is I'm kind of repeating broadly what I've already said, but I'm adding more, but I'm doing it all together in one space to really show that I'm treating these two sources as linked. I'm not simply saying, well, one source says this, the other source says that. In a lot of ways, this final part is the most important because it's where I'm drawing together my answer. I'm proving that it is actually a comparison, like I said, and not just a summary of two different things. Now, what I'm going to show you is how the AQA mark. I've found a resource that has got some parts of their answer, of an answer of their materials, and I'm going to explain to you how they mark specifically. So you'll notice that I have highlighted various different parts of this answer in different colours. Firstly, the writer of Source A describes Glastonbury not only as a modern festival, but one that is all about live music and bringing a range of different styles together. This includes Coldplay, Elvis Costello, and the American rock band The Killers, as well as a 1950s-style diner with rock and roll dancers and Elvis songs. Now, so this answer here has included the same evidence, obviously, that I picked. But the marking would have this as a clear textual reference, okay? Now, clear means that it is achieving band 3. Okay, so band 3 is 5 or 6 marks out of the 8. Now that means that straight away, because you've included some sort of evidence that is actually answering the question, that is all you need to do to get into a clear mark. It's not that hard, really. Obviously, if you just wrote that, you wouldn't get 6 out of 8. But the point is, you don't need to do anything more impressive than that to have a clear textual reference. This suggests that the organisers are trying to include as many different genres as possible. Furthermore, from this, we can infer that Glastonbury is intended to attract all and any music lovers. So you can see it's making generally similar points to the ones I made, and they have marked this as a clear inference. So as I used in the previous slide with green as inference, green is inference here, okay? This answer has found something that is, it's quite basic, really. It's not actually that hard, but it's found something beyond the text that is more than just the text, and therefore it is a clear inference, and so it's hit both parts of the mark scheme there. Whereas the writer of Source B presents the Greenwich Fair as far more theatrical and raucous. So there we go, clear statement of differences. So now those are all 3 parts of the mark scheme for AO1, and so therefore this answer is already looking at achieving 5 or 6 out of 8. Dickens talks about shops, bands, parades, pantomimes, and various other dramatic presentations. This suggests that the focus of the fair is on far more than just music. This tells the reader that the festival is chaotic and almost a sensory overload, with people not knowing what to do first. Now, from the materials from the AQA that I was looking at, they have said this is a perceptive inference from judicious reference. So the reference is the one that's in light blue there, and the inference is the one that is in green. But the fact you will notice is that it says perceptive means that they consider this to be good enough to be getting into band 4. So this is a good enough answer at this point to be achieving 7 or 8 marks out of 8. Therefore, the two texts differ. You'll see that what this answer has done is exactly what I'm instructing you to do, which is have this summary point at the end of this paragraph where you really actually show the differences between the texts. They differ as Glastonbury seems to be an event designed specifically for music fans and experts to come and more calmly appreciate some of the world's most famous bands. However, Greenwich is somewhere where anyone can come and find something enjoyable and fun to do, where there is much less structure but much more random excitement and communal spirit. So what they have here is links back to the difference perceptively. Now that word perceptive means that you have used implicit information and you have actually understood all aspects of the writer's meaning. You have not just said, well, here we go, we've got some of these and some of those, and brilliant, here's my answer. You have said, well, the writer says this, and I know from that this is what they actually mean. This is perceptive inference, okay? And that, therefore, would be enough for this to achieve the 8 marks. Finally, what I'm going to give you is a key phrase bank. Now, these are the kind of things you would use to help you write your answer. Like I said, there's no marks for writing nicely in Section A, but it never hurts, and also it can make what you're saying more clear. Now, obviously, how clearly you write is something you're being marked on. So, this is how you would use comparative words that show similarity. As they too, similarly, compared to, also, equally, correspondingly, furthermore, likewise, moreover, comparably. All right? The opposite now, comparative words that show difference. On the other hand, although, whereas, in contrast, rather than, unlike, however, on the contrary, nonetheless, conversely. And finally, these are probably the best ones to use. These are ones that show you are making an inference. Remember what I said about signposting that you're about to write your answer? Which suggests there is a sense that, showing how, perhaps, as shown in, demonstrating how, emphasizing, this creates, so this seems, indicating, and this signifies. I hope you found this deep dive into a specific language paper question to be helpful. Like I say, thank you to the AQA for some of the materials that I drew upon to help create this video. Make sure that you like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you next time for another one. Goodbye.